Welcome to The Backstory, a podcast from the North Dakota News Cooperative that takes an in-depth look at the stories we're reporting for you. I'm Sabrina Halvorson, CEO of the North Dakota News Cooperative. Joining me is Michael Standaert, our lead reporter. Right, Michael, the story we're talking about this week had the headline, Amid Continued Statewide Housing Shortfalls, Some Hope for Renewed Efforts. And so in this article, you were talking about housing needs throughout the state of North Dakota. And what I found interesting is in parts of this, you were really talking about some very specific rural areas and how a lack of housing in some of these areas can really suppress growth in these areas as well. So tell me a little bit about, we like to start out, tell me how you first came upon this article.
So I've been wanting to, I did a housing story maybe a year and a half ago, a couple of housing stories, and had been wanting to update where things are at. And then I saw this news come out about the Grand Forks region, how big of a housing shortfall they had in their area. And I was like, okay, that's something good to link this to. In that area, they have a shortfall of, I think it's like 4,800 homes. And this is all in rural parts of those counties. It's not Grand Forks City itself. So this is just in that surrounding area. And speaking with people up there, they said there's a lot of really great things going on. These towns want to grow. It's just difficult for them to grow because the lack of housing is one of the major sticking points. So, there might be some housing available. It might be dilapidated. There might be some other housing available that's super expensive on kind of the outskirts of the bigger cities. And then some of these smaller towns, they're kind of constrained by either in that area, it's the Red River floodplain, and then also just the farmland that's super valuable. So some of these cities can't really grow outside of their city proper, their town proper. That's one constraint they have. And then just getting developers to come in and rehabilitate a home or knock down a home and build a new one is extremely difficult because it's hard to attract them away from those bigger cities where they're making buck in those bigger cities on $400,000, $700,000 homes that some people are buying, but don't really fit that middle or starting home. So that's where the shortfall is in a lot of areas, whether it's Bismarck or Minot or some of the smaller towns. There's similar and different shortfalls. But I was interested in looking at what happened during the legislative session. I hadn't really focused too much on what was going on. There were so many bills that it's difficult to watch everything. And I remember that, Burgum had this housing announcement toward the end of his term. It seemed like something that there was a lot of support behind. And then Armstrong came in and had a similar plan. So I wanted to look at kind of what happened during the legislative session.
And so what did you find?
It was pretty interesting. There was a bill 2225, Senate Bill 2225, that had a $50 million program that would have incentivized infrastructure improvements across the state in order to get electricity, pipelines, things into these lots that could be developed. So that's one sticking point in many areas as well, is just getting the infrastructure in. And they had a staggered system of support for depending on the size of the community. 20,000 or less had a certain amount, and then 10,000 on downwards. And reading through the testimony, there was so much support. There were probably only 2 or 3 neutral testimonies that were submitted, and there were no testimonies that were against this plan. So it was surprising following it and looking at it on a few months after it's happened that it failed in committee right at the end of the session, like the last, several hours. In the middle of the night, I think it's like 2:10 a.m. is what it was voted on. And I don't really remember any reporting about the failure of that bill. And it's watching things in the region. It had been interesting to me to see how much reporting had been happening in South Dakota over the last few years about housing shortfalls, and they face a similar situation. There hadn't been as much here. And there had been a lot of reporting in South Dakota as well about what their plans were to try to deal with it. And Chris Shillikin, now the Commerce Commissioner, was with the South Dakota government during that program. So I reached out to them and learned more about what they had done with that and how there's quite a few similarities between the plan that was in South Dakota and what would have happened here in North Dakota if it would have passed.
So for each time you do a story, you always go and do a lot of research and really look into what you're reporting on. You make sure that everything is verifiable and credible. And I'm wondering for this story in particular, was there anything that surprised you as you were researching housing needs in North Dakota, or even like you were talking about what South Dakota went through?
No, nothing that was too surprising. The surprising thing for me was that there was no real kind of public discussion about the failure of that $50 million incentive program. If it would have been in another state, you probably would have heard a lot more or seen a lot more reporting about this situation. There's so many bills going through the legislature every biennium that it's really hard to keep track of what's going on. And there's so few journalists in the state that makes it even harder to kind of track all that. So I think the missing of things like this, and everybody, you always hear, oh, we have a housing crisis, we have a child care crisis, we have one crisis or another, and then somebody comes up with a plan to address it. They do a lot of work. During the last few months of Burgum's term, they had a series of all these different meetings and came up with a lot of studies. So much happens that there's never anything really done with it. If it's not funded by the legislature or it doesn't get funding by some other source, I guess for me, the surprising thing is why is there not more outcry about things like that when there is a failure of something that people think is such a crisis, and there was so much support, at least according to the testimony, for a program like this. Why doesn't anyone talk up after it fails and say, hey, this failed, we need to talk more about this?
Yeah.
I think for me, that's the most surprising part.
As the headline points out, too, despite the 22-25 failing, there are some who remain optimistic, hopeful that this issue will come back up and will get funded and looked into more. Is that what you found with several people, or how would you say overall that feeling is?
Yeah, there's an expectation that this or a similar bill will come back during next session, but that's a positive to people. But also, you get the sense from people too. It's like, okay, why do we have to wait a couple more years? This is something that could have kickstarted housing. I didn't report on this in the story, but I have some photos with the story about the Our program, which has brought housing in very quickly to Ellendale and to Grafton to help alleviate some of the really acute shortages there that were going to impact the businesses that have been trying to expand. Marvin Windows with Grafton and then Applied Digital with Ellendale. That came out through the Industrial Commission in mid last year and is kind of supported by the Bank of North Dakota. The legislature doesn't really have a ton to do with it. So there are programs out there. It's just not to the scale of what's needed from what people have been saying. And then what the legislature did approve is actually, I think, one of the highest levels they've approved, but it's still so small that it's such a competitive space to try to get those funds that it just makes it a huge competition for all these places to try to get any housing funding they can get. The need is really there from what people say. And if you look at all the testimony again, as I would keep repeating that, almost every testimony says, okay, this is a crisis, it's a crisis. Are people just saying that because they want this to get funded, or you know what? I tend to believe them that they believe it is a crisis, and it's deterring people from moving into a lot of the communities that need people, whether it's at a gas station or at a big business, at a school, medical center, nurses, this sort of thing. If they can't find houses to live in, and if they don't want to stay in an apartment for years, and they don't want their family to live in an apartment for years and years, or in some rundown place that hasn't been fixed up for 20, 30 years, it's difficult. Funding, I think there's hope that funding like this will eventually be released, but I think other people are also like, okay, this just sets us back 2 more years. So it seems like it'll eventually happen. It's just why not now and why later? For the people that are trying to bring more workforce into the state and address those challenges. I think things like this are a frustration. The only problem from a reporter's point of view is I wish people would point these things out more soon.
And we do have a news tips page on our website. You can find that at newscoopnd.org. And again, the article we were talking about today was headlined, "Amid Continued Statewide Housing Shortfalls, Some Hope for Renewed Efforts." You can read that story on our website at newscoopnd.org or in one of our local newspaper partners. For the North Dakota News Cooperative, I'm Sabrina Halvorson. This has been The Backstory.